I'm doing something wrong here. Okay, I think this will.
To click the up and down arrows
Um,
to move from one to the next. That's the next slide.
I just want to get rid of the picture of you, John, if I can.
You can't do that, I'm afraid.
Right. Oh, that's how
It
I'll
should be
put
quite
you right
small,
up in the top corner.
putting one
That's
side
fine.
on the screen.
Well, now, once again, everybody, I'm sorry to the muddle. Whatever else, I'm not very good at the technology. Now, this starts with really, what is a villa? Now, villas really started partly because Edinburgh, as you see on the left, in the 16th or 17th century, and as you see on the right, there's Auld Reekie. And Edinburgh was a filthy black place in which to live. And anybody who had any resources behind them wanted to have two houses. One house in the town for business and other activities, politics, the law, or whatever, and one house outside the town where they could go and live in the sort of comfort that they chose to live in. As a result, Edinburgh was completely surrounded by villas. And there were many small villas in the centre of the town in the days when the town was quite small, the old town. And as the town grew, most of these villas got swallowed up in the surrounding growth of the town. Some of them have survived. And if you look at these pictures, on the top left is Mavisbank House, late 18th century villa in Stockbridge, belonging to a family called Rose. He was a solicitor. The grounds originally included what's now known as Saxe Coburg Place. You will find solicitors and the law quite common in this story, but also tradesmen, merchants, and so on. They all like to have a small place outside the town where they either commuted from or went for the weekend or went for a summer holiday. Now, now I've gone too far. Oh, and there were some quite substantial villas around the town. This is Caroline Park, which belonged to the Viscount Tarbert, whose main family estate was in Easter Ross. And it was important for him to have a house which was close to the government. He had various important legal and activities. He was a judge. And so this was his villa close to the town. Another example is Hawk Hill House. Hawk Hill, designed by John Adam in 1757, now sadly demolished in the 1970s by the City Council, in whose ownership it came. Hawk Hill House, I say, was built for Lord Aylmore, who was a judge, another lawyer with a villa just outside the town. The only thing that survived when it was demolished was a splendid series of wall paintings or panel paintings by Delacour, which are now stored in the basement in the City Art Centre until some of us can get them out again. Another villa, New Hales, which some of you might have visited since it's now a National Trust house. It was built by the important architect, the main predecessor of William Adam, James Smith. James Smith studied in Italy, travelled, was the most important architect in Scotland at the very beginning of the 18th century, late 17th, beginning of the 18th century. When in Italy, he'd become very interested in Palladio. He was the master of Colin Campbell, the author of Vitruvius Britannicus and is sometimes described as the originator of Palladianism in the UK. Another villa, the Drum, this by William Adam, with engravings from Vitruvius Scoticus on the right, full of splendid plasterwork by Calderwood and Clayton, now just as it were within the eastern part of the town, and one of relatively few which are surviving. Now, the center piece of all this is this man, John Clerk. John Clerk, son of the first John Clerk of Penicuik, is a hugely underrated man in the history of the intellectual Scotland in the 18th century. He studied in Glasgow and in Leiden, and he went on the most amazing grand tour. When in Rome, he studied music and architecture were his great interests. He studied music, composition, and the harpsichord under Corelli and Pasquini. And when he came back, he said he played the harpsichord rather better than became a gentleman. He also wrote a very important report on the economy of Scotland in 1705. And unsurprisingly, if it's a familiar story, found that the economy of Scotland was very poor, mainly because of the failed Darien adventure of colony and the Panama Isthmus of America. After that, he became a commissioner for the Union in 1707. He did all sorts of things. After that, he became a Baron of Exchequer, that is the court set up to financial affairs of Scotland. But as I say, his main interest was music and architecture. And a great deal of what he thought was written down in this poem, The Country Seat. This is a copy of contemporary document. His writing is almost illegible, but you can see top left a poem by Sir John Clerk, B.A.V., Baron of Exchequer. But this particular copy was transcribed by a man in London, Samuel Boyes, known as a poet. And I'm going to read you this. Now would you choose a villa where, retired from busy crowds and from domestic noise, you may possess the sweets of leisure hours, then raise a structure so confined in size as may secure this valuable prize. Not long nor long suspended, let your thoughts remain, what form to choose, that always is the best, which the pavilion of a Persian king in bulk and beauty may resemble most. Here both the painter's and the sculptor's art may vie with one another, and 'tis here the builder's skill in proper ornaments, without confusion and in polished walls, by beautiful pilasters will be known. Here in a garden like a gaudy flower, whose leaves no tempest can devour, the joyful owner sees his rural bower. Well, that puts quite a lot in place as far as the villa, this place in the country that either the merchants and the tradesmen and the lawyers who lived in the city wanted to escape to, and where grandees from the remote country who wanted a place which was close to the government, to the courts or anything like that, could come to leave their remote places and be close to the capital and close to the city. Now, that is supposed to be an introduction to the concept of the villa. As I'm going to point out later on, Sir John Clerk is suggested by some to have been the very first person to introduce the word villa in this context to the English language. Villas, of course, were known up the Thames, houses like Chiswick, Marble Hill, and so on, exactly the same thing in relation to London as the villas around Edinburgh were and are. This, I'm supposed to be talking about the villas of the Esk. And on this map, you see the South Esk to the right, the North Esk to the left, going from the foothills of the Pentlands down to Musselburgh, joining up at Dalkeith. Now, just going down from the top, Rosebery, not a very great house, but again, in its present form, built by a man called Robert Hebburn, who was Commissioner of Customs. He had intended to build a much more grand house in 1810, but never achieved that. But once again, a lawyer with a place in the city, and he was able to commute, whether regularly or irregularly, from his villa on the South Esk into the town. Now, Arniston, which is a house that many of you will know, the Vitruvius Scoticus elevation on the bottom, and a portrait of Robert Dundas, top left, the man who built it, designed by William Adam. This is technically not a villa, because Clerk describes in the country seat 4 types of house. He refers to the royal palace, the house of state, the mansion of the great, in which he had probably Hopetoun, Hamilton Palace, places like that in mind. And he had the house of middle rank for convenience and use, the centerpiece of a country estate, but not necessarily a hugely grand one. And Arniston fits well into that category. Nevertheless, the fact that its owners were prominent lawyers who had business in the city meant that it really was, in practical terms, a villa. I think it's important in considering this definition of a villa that a villa is not a style of architecture. I think sometimes imagined that you can define what a villa is in terms of architectural style. It's not that. It is a matter of use, a matter of its purpose, function in use around the city, a place from which people could commute to and from. Now I'm going down the river. Many of you will know probably more villas than I do, but I'm going straight to Dalkeith Palace. Again, the Vitruvius Scoticus elevation in the bottom, and a nice view at the top. Again, designed by James Smith, the man I referred to as possibly the founder of English Palladianism, and developed and extended also by William Adam. Built about 1700 for Anna, Duchess of Buccleuch. It looks rather more like a royal palace than even a house of state or a villa, but in practical terms, it was a villa, because the Buccleuchs, the centre of the Buccleuchs' activity, was not in Dalkeith, and indeed, Dalkeith Palace still belongs to the Buccleuch estate, and it isn't either Bow Hill or the house in the southwest, great house in the southwest. So in a sense, though it's not quite used as such, it is potentially a villa. Now I'm moving forward to the North Esk. The highest house on the North Esk is New Hall. And New Hall was developed from an old house by Sir David Forbes, again a lawyer, an advocate, and which took its present form under advice from his neighbour, and I think closely related Sir John Clerk, famous for its association with Alan Ramsay, William Aikman, painters, because Forbes was involved with something called the Worthies Club, which many artists and others were members of, and they used to be entertained and have summer spells at New Hall. So again, in relation to the city. And then we move on to Penicuik House, the centre of the Clerk estate. Once again, a house of middle rank for convenience and use rather than a villa as such, designed by Baron Clerk, Sir John Clerk's son, Sir James Clerk, and built by the mason architect John Baxter in the 1760s. Notable for its completely symmetrical plan, as you see in the centre. Once again, a house of middle rank for convenience and use. It was developed in the 1850s by the addition of wings, very skillfully designed to blend beautifully with the 1760s architecture. It is surrounded by the most wonderful landscape, which probably many of you will know, designed and laid out by Sir John Clerk, Baron Clerk, and it also has, or had, I should say, splendid interiors, including the famous Ossian Hall, built in following the development of the concept of Ossian by Macpherson in the 18th century and decorated by Thomas Bonner. The landscape actually brings to life something else, or illustrates something else about the concept of the villa, is that it is supposed to be in a beautiful setting, or in a setting which, if not originally beautiful with great views and so on, is made beautiful by a landscape, policies, or in the case of small villas, a fine garden. Picturesque was one of the qualities which a villa naturally would have. Moving on, Auchendirnie, built by a man called John Ingalls, whose main base was in Lanarkshire, and again, a place where he had easy access to the town, designed right at the end of the 17th century by Sir William Bruce, the architect of Holyrood Palace, Kinross House, and so on. And you can perhaps see that simple form with a slightly bell-cast roof, two advanced pavilions with screen walls and so on, very much in that sort of style. Now, I'm moving on down the river, and we next come to another place with which you'll all be familiar, Rosslyn Castle, which had been in the hands of the Sinclairs, again, whose original estates were in the far north, but for a very long time from the Middle Ages, and still in the hands of the Earl and Countess of Rosslyn. And the main thing you can say about Rosslyn Castle is that it's picturesque. Nothing could be more picturesque, I think, than Rosslyn, as this view very well illustrates. And again, going down the river, Hawthornden, which was owned by the Drummonds from the Middle Ages until the late 18th century, and of course was the home of William Drummond, the poet. A place for honest ease is a phrase that comes out of one of his poems, and a place of honest ease is actually another good term, I think, for a villa. Latterly, when I got to know it, it passed into the hands of Drew Hines from the Heinz family, who put a fair amount of money into it, and it became and is a retreat for writers. And again, I think a place for culture, art, picturesqueness in reach of the city, in function at least, a villa. And then going on down the river, we come to the house, which is the other part of the title of my talk, Mavisbank. Very much the center of the villa concept. I'm not going to talk about Mavisbank now. I'm going to continue following the path of the rivers, and I will come back to Mavisbank and have a lot to say further on in the talk. But going on down, we have Barony House, a thatched cottage ornée. You can see the thatch on the right, and a cottage ornée, very much very romantic cottage in appearance, but actually really much more than a cottage, has of course developed later, and Barony House was the home of Sir Walter Scott when he was first married. He lived in Barony from 1798 to 1803. It was part of the Clerk estate. I should have said in Lasquade. So the far end of the Mavisbank landscape, very close. And it returned to the Clerk family for use as a dower house later, after Sir Walter Scott's time. Two more views of, or three more views of Barony, perhaps showing the original thatched cottage rather more clearly. The next down the river is Melville, designed by James Playfair for Henry Dundas, who was a son of Robert Dundas of Arniston, and built in the 1780s. Henry Dundas was once again a prominent lawyer and politician, famous for all sorts of things, as a member of Parliament and a minister, Home Secretary, I think, in the government in London, who became Viscount Melville. And again, Melville Castle was the place where he retreated for country pleasure, away from the busy world of the city, in his case, more London than Edinburgh. And again, going on down the river, down the North Esk, until one comes to Dalkeith Palace again, because the grounds of Dalkeith Palace is where the North Esk and the South Esk join up. And as one goes down the river, one comes to what is sometimes described as a complete nest of villas, Inveresk. Inveresk became full of houses, which are very much villas on the top of a rise, great views, and a range of different houses. And I'm not going to describe them all individually, but Inveresk Lodge on the left, Manor House on the right, and Inveresk House on the left there, and Hawkerston on the right, with its very interesting square plan and central chimney stack. So Inveresk is almost the natural thing that people think about in terms of villas, because the size and scale of the building and the way they fit together, I think, fulfill the architectural concept of the villa, as well as the functional concept. And now I'm going on to the center of the talk, which is about Mavisbank. In these two portraits, On the left is Sir John Clerk as an older man, and William Adam, the architect. These two paintings were done by William Aikman in London at exactly the same time in 1727. And that happened because Clerk was always visiting country houses all around the country. His passions were music and architecture. And this is just illustrates the concept of Clerk going to London and to think much more about villas. Here is the very beginning of architecture of all sorts. Would you, my friend, avoid the noisy town and from the cares and toils of life be free? Would you unbend your thoughts and thus acquire fresh oil to lighten up the vital flame? Choose then a rural life in such a field as Eden's garden best resemble can, where first the Almighty power established man. Now, the point about this is that Clerk and Adam, Clerk was busy touring the country, visiting people and looking at houses, but they met up in Stamford and travelled to London together. And the reason I quoted from the introduction of the country seat there was that Clerk had with him his manuscript for the country seat to take to the poet Samuel Boys in London. He called him Boys the Transcriber. And this edition, which I've been reading to you, is the copy that Boys made and which returned to London with Clerk. Vitruvius Scoticus is William Adams' book of designs, following on from Colin Campbell's Vitruvius Scoticus, Vitruvius Britannicus, that of course following on from William Adams' predecessor, James Smith. Adam had his own drawings for Vitruvius Scoticus with him, which he gave to the engraver, Richard Cooper, in London. So this little journey from Stamford to London was a very important thing. 1727, that happened. So that was in many ways a key date for the development of architecture in Scotland. Clerk's and Adams' cooperation was in the creation of the House of Mavisbank, which you see here in the engravings from Vitruvius Scoticus. If it's possible, you'll see on the bottom of the bottom left of the elevation, William Adam de Lynn, and on the right, Richard Cooper sculpt. So the drawing and the engraver both recorded on that. But in fact, William Adam wasn't really the designer of Mavisbank. Sir John Clerk, the second baronet, was himself. And the bottom left drawing is actually in Clerk's own hand, with the center and right. That's the basement plan on the left, the entrance plan, the center, and the principal floor plan, the one floor up from the entrance on the right. And the layout is very typical of this sort of architecture on this sort of scale. Small house, truly a villa. And Clerk built it because the old house at Penicuik, commonly known as New Bigging, was a rambling old house. When he was married and for a second time and his children, he acquired the house of Camo to the west side of Edinburgh as a place to bring up his small children. And that was his villa at that time then, from which he travelled in and out of the capital. When his father died in 1722, there had been a plan to rebuild the old house of Penicuik, turn the old house of New Bigging into a new Penicuik house. But Sir John Clerk decided not to do that, but instead to leave it as it was and to leave thoroughly unfashionably today the women, the children, the dogs, the horses, all the paraphernalia of running an estate back at Penicuik. while he would build this villa for himself, where he would entertain his friends, have his pictures, his library, and commute to and from the capital. Penicuik is 22 miles from Edinburgh. Mavisbank is 11 miles, half the distance, and he wrote that he could commute from the city on horseback daily if he wished to. I said that one of the important things about a villa was its landscape setting, the gardens which were created around it. And in Mavisbank, he laid out, there was woodland, three, what's called a goosefoot of avenues going to the northeast, central one with a canal and a ducat at the end of it, left-hand one going into the hill, right-hand one going into open view down the valley, and his walled garden down below the house on the banks of the river. And this is what it looked like in a painting of about 1800, looking down that central avenue with the canal and the house at the end of it. Mavisbank, of course, had has had a very difficult history. It passed out of the hands of the Clerks relatively early in its life, and late in the 19th century was extended massively to create what then was generally called an asylum, a private asylum for people of some substance who needed to be looked after because they were mentally unfit to carry on a normal life. But this particular photograph of the mid-19th century shows the house as it was before that happened. Then, in the 1950s, it was acquired by a man called Dr. Harrows, who'd been the medical superintendent in the asylum, and he so loved the place that he bought it, and he obtained one of the first grants from the newly formed Historic Buildings Council to pay for the demolition of all the wings. That is utterly extraordinary. How Mavisbank came upon somebody like that, who really valued the house so much that he would spend a lot of money in reducing the quite substantial late 19th century architectural additions to return it to its 18th century form. Dr. Harrows' son, David Harrows, is still very much with us and has been a great supporter and a trustee of the Mavisbank Trust. So what the Harrows done for Mavisbank is very substantial. Then, as many of you may know, disaster struck. It fell into the hands of a rogue called Archie Stevenson, who broke up cars in the forecourt, created a complete shambles, and eventually set it on fire. And that's how it remained. And that's how it more or less remains to this day. It came so close to demolition in the 1980s that the Midlothian Council entirely properly served a demolition order, and the demolition contractors' machines were on site when what was then called the Scottish Georgian Society raised a case in the Court of Session and requesting an interdict. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, on the same day that the demolition was due to start, Lord Kirkwood served the interdict. So Mavisbank came within a matter of a few hours to ultimate demolition. Extraordinarily, it survived. Historic Scotland, or whatever it was called then, was required to put up a security fence and scaffolding around it. And the Scottish Georgian Society was required to put a 24-hour watch on site until the security fence was up and it was protected, made safe to that extent. And I had the great pleasure of spending one or two of those nights in the first week or two before the fence went up, and had the pleasure of seeing the sunrise on the front of the house, rarely, because the house faces northeast. And characteristically of 18th century houses, the main front faces away from the sun, and the garden front faces the sun, so that the garden is sunny, and the more formal entrance doesn't really have to be sunny. But I had the pleasure of seeing the sun on the main frontage. Clerk's interests are extremely well expressed. And on each of the plinths of Mavisbank House, there is an inscription. And I don't know how good your Latin is, but I can translate that for you in a minute. That's on the left hand. The other one, the previous one, was on the left hand plinth, and this is on the right hand plinth. I'll come back to those inscriptions later on. More recently, some very rigorous survey work has been done using drones and photography, flying over the place like this, and the creation of what's called a point cloud created by the lasers, and then converted. The point cloud turned into extremely accurate, within a quarter of an inch, I believe, things are shown with this sort of accuracy by the lasers. Then going on from that, accurate reconstructions of what the house should look like were created from the ruins as they currently are. This following on from that painting from the central avenue down the canal, then moving closer up, following, as I say, the form of the house as it now is, with the communications following the Vitruvius Scarticus drawing, the wings plastered or tiled, the forecourt with a fence and steps round the frontage to create the court. The second part of the exercise, done at this time, and in fact still in progress, has been the examination of documents. The Clerk papers are utterly extraordinary, to the extent that Sir John Clerk, the Baron, kept every single paper, every single invoice and note. And a colleague, historian William Kay, has looked at 1,000 documents from the Clerk papers. And these are just some small examples of information that comes out, you see, dated 1723, agreement with Mr. Adams in 1729, and the bottom right to the Honourable Baron Clerk. Anyway, an account signed George Hill as a tradesman. Now, every single document is there. We know who every tradesman was. The carver was Isaac Silverstein. The executive mason was John Baxter Sr. The painter was James Norrie. And we know not only that, but in descriptions in the invoices of everything that they did. And on the back of that information, it has been possible, with great accuracy, to reconstruct the principal interiors. And this is a drawing of the entrance hall, with mahogany stair, with the corner balusters capped with Corinthian capitals, a sky and clouds ceiling, and that is that drawing translated into a very authentic representation of what the entrance hall of Mavisbank was like. The parlour, which was immediately behind the entrance hall, looking out onto the garden front, fully panelled with all the panels painted by James Norrie. I said James Norrie was the decorator, but he is famous for his landscape paintings. And I should say that these versions of James Norrie's painting were painted by William Kay at 1:50 scale. They still create a very remarkable reconstruction of what the interior of this house was like. As I say, we know all the tradesmen, we know exactly what mouldings and so on they used, and all this comes together. It's the most wonderful thing to have happened in the last 2 or 3 years, to have been able to do this work, carry forward the recreation in drawn and visual form of the interiors of the house. So we actually now know a great deal about the exterior of the house, and we also know a great deal about the interior, and it's all capable of being tested and checked on the basis of the invoices. Clerk was clearly a very original man in everything that he did, and this was the blue with which the great dining room on the principal floor was painted, maybe one of the first examples of Prussian blue in the country, since Prussian blue arrived only at exactly this time. Once again, the panels all covered with Norrie paintings, and here is a reconstruction of that room. And the painting with Norrie panels, the painting over the chimney piece is not actually the correct one, but we do know what that painting is, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The other extraordinary thing which happened recently is that among some furniture which were being sold at Lion and Turnbull's, evidence which William Kay was able to produce, shown on the top, indicated that the mahogany dining room table up for sale was the dining room table purchased for Mavisbank in 1733. Also, it is now believed by David Jones, furniture historian St Andrews, to be one of the first mahogany dining tables of this sort in the UK, since mahogany was only introduced from Jamaica at about that time. And every piece of that table is made up of single pieces of mahogany. So you can imagine the size of the trees from which they were taken. And here are two of the paintings. On the left, the painting over the chimney piece was a Rubens, which didn't survive in the Clerk family and is now in the museum in Bonn, of a man called the Bishop of Ghent, who was a Scotsman. And it's also recorded that Clerk, possibly on that trip to London in 1727, visited the Earl of Pembroke, sometimes known as the Architect Earl, his villa. Goodness me. Next, my memory is failing me. Not my memory, my brain. Next to Chiswick, Marble Hill. And we know that when he visited Pembroke at Marble Hill, Pembroke gave him a portrait of himself. This is not the actual portrait, but we believe that the portrait is still in the Clerk collection at Penicuik. Now, I return to Clerk and the country seat, and just going back over where we have been, I started by talking about the nature of a villa. A small house, ideally picturesque, in a beautiful garden or landscape, with fine views to the hills or the sea or whatever, close to the city, and that in the context of Edinburgh was surrounded by these small villas, swallowed up by the city as it expanded. Some even removed by the new town when the new town was built, and others surviving with a fairly small selection, like Deanbank, Murrayfield, and so on. And then the rather more substantial villas further out of the town. Again, all these villas were created by people of substance in the city. They might have been merchants or tradesmen, or trades, I should say, which then, as of now, or then would have been members of the merchant company or the incorporated trades, and to a very substantial extent, lawyers. One might say all the professions, but in those days, accountants and surveyors and architects even had hardly been invented. And one talks about the professions, one really thinks of the lawyers, because the lawyers were ever with us. These villas were built. Everybody or people of substance generally had two houses. The clerks themselves had a house in the Cowgate, which was then one of the best parts of the old town, south facing, without the development further south having happened. So they had their house in the Cowgate and their country house at Penicuik. And later on, Sir John had his house at Penicuik, his old house at Penicuik, had his townhouse in the Cowgate, and his villa, where he could, as I say, entertain, keep his pictures and his library, and generally live the sort of life which an intellectual and very personable man could live in. Coming back to the villas of the Esk, there is this run of villas down the South Esk and the North Esk, some of which I'm sure you know of, others that I haven't referred to tonight. And of course, I've referred to houses which perhaps not obviously villas. Penicuik and Arniston are not obviously villas, but they were villas in function from where the owners commuted, probably too far to be daily, but commuted back and forward for their place as session court judges or Baron of Exchequer, whatever. So going down the South Esk to the great house of Dalkeith, again, hardly a villa, but it was a place where the Macluse could live other than Bow Hill or Drumlanrig, which again was close to the city. If you were that wealthy, you would have a number of big houses. It may also be worth saying that Dalkeith Palace was originally designed by James Smith, supposedly on the model of Dutch house of Hetlow. And I almost put a drawing of Hetlow up along with a view of Dalkeith, but I missed that one out. And then we go down further to Inveresk, which, as I say, was a great clutch of villas, all of this fairly small size, not dissimilar to the villas around closer in around Edinburgh. I haven't quite worked out quite why that happened at Inveresk, but the communication, the road, must, I think, have been very good from Inveresk to the city, and of course with great views of the sea and the places close, Musselburgh and so on. And then coming back to Mavisbank and Clerk. Clerk, just as I say, was an extraordinary man, and he's thought by some to have been the author of the first use of the word villa in the present context. And the poem ends like this: "Now stop, my muse, your bold and arduous flight, and dare no more the vast Pierian height. On Eska's flowery bank there is a grove, where the harmonious thrush repeats his love. There I'll observe the precepts you indite, but never any more attempt to write. Some may perhaps, amidst the numerous throng of swains, attentive listen to your song, and from your general rules instructions take, what edifice to raise or gardens make. But others are, on whom those rules you waste, for Goths will always have a Gothic taste." Well, and that is the view of Mavisbank as it is now, and that's the end of my talk. I don't think it's been quite as long as I